All right, so let's talk about biometrics. First thing we need to do, since we're talking about biometrics, is first talk about authentication and identification. And since you're in this class, that means that you had me for 4663, and we went over authentication and identification a little bit in that class. And that's really one of the fundamentals of human-computer interaction, is that in order to gain access to a computer, or in order to gain access to one of the services it's providing, we need to identify ourselves and we need to authenticate ourselves. Now recall that there's a distinction between identification and authentication, and they're not the same thing. Identification essentially means that you're determining if someone is known to the system, and that is you're presenting yourself with some form of identification that indicates you are some type of user of the system. Now, of course, with some forms of identification, we know that we can fake driver's license numbers and we can steal people's user IDs. The next step of that is to authenticate that person's identification. So you present your user identification to a system, which typically on a day-to-day basis is going to be a user ID or whatever. Authentication verifies the identity of that person, so it's really two separate concepts that actually work together. And so let's just think about traditional techniques involving identification and authentication. For computers, typically, as I said, you use our username, P. Kreger, M. Monroe, A.N. Smith. If we're talking about, let's say, going to an ATM machine, we have our bank card. And that supposedly identifies us. And that's actually outside of the realm of it's a little different from a username, but let's just move on to authentication. Authentication will actually verify to the system that we are who we say we are. So we're using two different known things here, your identification and authentication. Just because somebody knows who you are and has your identification, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have your password or your PIN code. And of course, that's why it's important that we keep the information that we use to authenticate private, so that we can keep other users from violating our privacy and using services they shouldn't be using by posing as someone that they aren't. So identification, we understand, is to show, is to provide the system information saying that we are this user or this person on the system. Authentication then verifies that, and there's three methods, general methods of authentication that can be used. There's something you have, something you know, and something that you are. Biometrics, of course, is going to be something that you are, but let's look at the first two. Something that you have. So, well, actually, let's go to the second one, something you know, because that's actually the simplest. Something you know is going to be what? It's going to be a password, or it's going to be a PIN code, or something of that nature. So it's something that you've got in your head that you've memorized, hopefully, that will use to authenticate yourself. Something that you have is something that you physically have on you that's not part of you, that's used to authenticate yourself. So you could actually use, let's say, a smart card that's got information on you in it. So you could use that. We have things like secure ID keys, RSA secure ID keys. You may want to Google for that and see what it says about that, which also uses encryption, public-private key encryption, to indicate who you are. And then finally, there's something that you are, and that is going to be something on you, something about your physical person, or even your behavior, that would authenticate you as the person who you say you are. Strong authentication will use two of the former methods of authentication to authenticate yourself. So, I mean, that's fairly simple. So if we flip back here for a second, it could be something you have and something you know, or it could be something you have and something you are, or something you know and something you are. And what that is if something breaks down, let's say somebody guesses your password, they still might not have your RSA secure ID key, so they couldn't authenticate to the system. But by having two separate methods of authentication, it makes authentication much stronger and much harder to fake. So realize, though, that just because you have a username and a password, that is not strong authentication, because essentially that's just two things that you know. In order to have strong authentication, you would have to combine that with something you know or something that you are. And of course, three-factor authentication is the strongest type of authentication, because then it uses all three of those. So it could use a password, it could use a secure RSA secure ID, and it could also be a fingerprint, let's say. So the third factor, biometrics, something that you are. This is what biometrics is all about. So as I indicated earlier, businesses are very interested in that for several reasons. One is that supposedly, if it's done right, biometrics is supposed to be a very good, strong measure of authentication, because it's not something really that you can forget or that you can lose. Because if you think about it, how many different systems do you log into every day, and how many different passwords do you use? Well, a lot of times what people do, because they may have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different systems they log into, if they're required to have different passwords, what do they do with those passwords? They write them down and they stick it on a sticky note underneath their monitor or underneath their keyboard, which can be easily stolen. Something you have, trust me, I lose my keys and my sunglasses all the time. So unless you've somehow secured this token or whatever you're using is something that you have to your own person, if you lose that, then you're unable to authenticate. However, we always have the means to biometrically authenticate, because we are who we are. So whether it's looking at an iris scan or a retinal scan or fingerprints or facial recognition, anything like that, we always have that means of authentication with us. And businesses have been interested in this because it is hard to fake, but also what they're trying to do is reduce the cost of authentication, because when somebody forgets their passwords or they lose their authentication token, what do you have to do? Well, if you lose the authentication token, you have to replace it. Or if you've forgotten your password, you have to call somebody at the help desk, so you're using their time. And being able to biometrically authenticate hopefully will reduce cost. It just says reduce the size, and that is the size of the authentication, as we'll learn later on, is that this biometric information is not stored as a raw file, as raw data, but it's actually stored as a template, so you can have a very small amount of information associated with your biometric authentication. Also, to increase accuracy, is that where we want to know for 100% whether somebody authenticating is who they say they are. And also ease of use. I mean, imagine if you're just able, and some of you may have, let's say, one of the IBM ThinkPads that allows you to biometrically authenticate using one of your fingers. Is that rather than typing something in, and if you're like me, you may type the password in wrong, or you may have the caps lock on. And sometimes passwords are just very difficult to use because you also may forget them. But if you can just walk up to your computer and scan it across a scanner and it authenticates you, then that increases the ease of use of the authentication mechanism. Okay, let's look at some problems with things you know. Once again, the username and the password are things you know. The first thing is to keep it private, making sure that no one else knows it. And as I said earlier, is that if you forget these passwords, you're more likely to write them down. You leave this stuff hanging out where everybody can see it. So walking by a cubicle in any sort of business, you may see dozens of passwords just laying out anywhere. Also, people tend to choose easy to remember passwords because it's difficult to remember difficult passwords. And once again, those are written down. And that's just a real big problem. So even though that started out and we're still using passwords, you know, they're good for right now, but as the technology becomes cheaper and better, then we'll find that more and more systems are going to be biometric based. Problems with things you have, of course, is they can be stolen, they can be lost, and they can be broken. Now imagine that you are on a trip to Asia, you're in Kyoto, Japan, and you lose one of your authentication tokens. Oh my God, what do I do? I can't log in, and I have to wait somebody to Federal Express overnight for probably $50 or $100 another secure token so I can log into the system. I can log into my computer. Well, that wouldn't happen if you were authenticating biometrically. The great things about biometric authentication is it can't be lost. Your method of authentication can't be lost. At least not easily. And you're probably thinking right now, well, geez, if I've got a fingerprint scan and I lose one of my fingers, well, hopefully that won't happen. You're more likely to use a secure token than you are one of your fingers. It can't be guessed or read by someone else. In fact, you don't even know. You don't even know what your template looks like. Only the machine and the algorithm that actually creates the template of your biometric authenticator knows what that looks like. And it's difficult to uniquely identify. And before I go on with that, let's step back up to the second bullet up here. If you have a fingerprint or a picture of a face, a recording of a voice, those can be duplicated if you think about it. If you search out on the web for biometrics, fingerprint, and gummy bears, you'll find that somebody's actually been able to actually capture their thumbprint on a gummy bear and actually fake out one of the fingerprint biometric authenticators. You can also get a picture of a face, and of course you can get a recording of a voice. So it's not the fact that these things are not beatable, it's just that it's much harder to beat them than stealing somebody's passwords. So biometrics, just like the other forms of authentication, do have their problems. The key is where the problems can be addressed. And one of the big problems with biometrics is right now it's kind of expensive because it's a fairly new technology, and until this becomes more mainstream, then the price is going to be higher. But as you can see, is that you're actually starting to find more and more of these systems out in the real world. And the great thing about biometrics is that it's out of the hands of the user, the authentication mechanism, in the hands of the systems developer. It's up to the systems developer to develop the system that allows you to read one of your biometrics off your body and actually create a template of that and then store that somewhere. So the definition of biometrics is any human characteristic which may be used for biometric authentication and identification. So realize here is that we're actually having authentication, identification in one biometric system. The U.S. National Biometric Test Center defined it as the automatic identification or identity verification of living human individuals based on behavioral or psychological characteristics. I'm sorry, physiological characteristics. Psychological characteristics wouldn't make any sense. But notice that this says physiological. So when we're talking about physiological, we're talking about thumbprints, facial scans, things of that nature. Behavioral will be the way you act. So actually, handwriting would be one form of a behavioral biometric authenticator, as would be spoken speech. I want you to think of the first time you actually heard about biometrics. Think about a TV program where you heard it, or a movie. It's been used in movies for a while, but if you think back to the earliest one I can think of would be Star Trek, when Kirk would talk to the computer, and clearly the computer would want to authenticate Kirk's voice before it actually did anything. Otherwise anybody could come up and speak a command that only a commander is supposed to speak, if that made any sense. So as I indicated previously, biometrics can now be used for both identification and authentication. So you don't have to present your credentials indicating I am Philip Kreger or I am Abraham Lincoln. Rather, it can look at the template, it can recall that template that you've previously enrolled. These will be terms that we'll talk more deeply about a little later on. But and it would search that and compare it. It would take the biometric information from you. It would change that into a template, and then it would search through its database of templates to find the closest match. So essentially it's doing identification and authentication at the same time. So it presents unique challenges because you're not identifying yourself, so now it has to search the entire database. If you think about this, when you identify yourself to a computer with a username, when you put in your password, that's encrypted, and then the computer goes out and will look at the username in the password file and compare the two hashes, the one stored in the password file and the other one that you've just inputted. And so it's a very simple solution because it's really only looking at a single entry in the identity database. However, with combining authentication and identification, now the system's actually having to go through there and look at every potential match for the authentication that's going through. So what does biometric authentication buy us? Hopefully increase security, because now somebody can't steal our physiological or our behavioral identity, because hopefully it's uniquely associated with us. We have increased convenience, which means that we can more easily log into a system. We don't have to remember those convoluted passwords. And also increased accountability, because if we have the higher the level of true positives, that is the higher level of matches, that means that you can't go back and say that you are not the user of the system, because we know based upon your physiological characteristics that it was indeed that person that was using the system at the time. So what are some of the uses for biometric authentication? We can be used for fraud detection, fraud deterrence, and amongst other things. If somebody's trying to use a system when they're not supposed to, a biometric authentication is going to deter them and or prevent them from using the system. And finally, what are some of the characteristics, both physiological and behavioral? With respect to physiological, we have fingerprints. We've probably seen that for a time. We have paw prints. We have facial characteristics. We have iris scans. We also have retinal scans. And we have voice imprints. Behavioral is signature, you're writing your signature, gestures, and typing. As we will find out, is that not all of these are of the same level of accuracy. What we'll find is that some are much better than others. And particularly the physiological characteristics are usually much more accurate than the behavioral characteristics. And then within the physiological characteristics, some of them are much more accurate than others. And also, there's something that I haven't talked about before, but there's a level of privacy and intrusion, and that is the ability to quickly, effectively, and conveniently get the biometric data. And therefore, that's why things like there's a trade-off between accuracy and the ability to acquire that information. So, for example, with a fingerprint, you just stick your hand down. It's very easy. It's very convenient for users, as well as the palm print. However, things like an iris scan requires you to actually put your eye up to a sensor for a few seconds, and you have to hold very still while the biometric data is being read off your iris. So even though, as it turns out, that the iris is by far the most accurate because it has 256 points of comparison for the template, it's not that convenient for users, because a lot of people don't want to stick their eye up near a sensor for 5 or 10 seconds just to have it read. So that was a very quick introduction to biometrics. We will get more and more into this in the next few weeks, but right now, by now you should have read the readings that I placed on the web, and go ahead and replay this audio and video if you need, and then we'll get more in depth into biometrics in the next class, which should be up shortly.